So, I started thinking about my ancestors and, what's up with the ancestors? It seems like every one of them had challenges during their 40s. So I want to talk about these folks. So my paternal grandfather, Jesse Anderson, who was a doctor, he was in World War I. He was a military guy, and when he ushered out, by that time he had gotten the Spanish flu. He had tuberculosis at the age of 44, and in poor health, had to give up his medical practice, and he died at 54. Um, his his wife Lori, my grandmother, my father's mother, she was widowed at 46, and she was able to rebuild her life by marrying a very rich Southern tycoon in Columbus, Georgia, where she initially lived. And she lived the next 25 years as his wife very successfully. They loved each other. And when he died, she inherited a trust that kept her in good stead for the rest of her life. My grandfather, Franz, who's upper right, he was a cotton merchant. He was from Germany. He came to the United States around 1900, met Lucy Banas in Savannah, and married her, and they went back with their three kids to Germany in 1921. But at 29, in 1929, he went bankrupt at 50. And they moved back to the United States from Germany, not from back to the South, but to New York. And he sold life insurance and retired. And he was supported by his granddaughter, died at 72. And then my grandmother, Lucy, she was bankrupt along with Franz, of course. She transitioned from a middle-class matron to a department store clerk. Quite a comeuppance. And I don't think she ever forgave Franz for that change in her station. She retired later and supported by a single daughter. And then here's my father. He was a doctor as well, and he ended up moving to California after the war, practiced medicine, and at the age of 47, he ended up in a wheelchair due to an injury and was in a great deal of pain during the latter part of his life, and he died at 54. Very challenging. I'll talk a little more about him later. His widow, my mother, Frances, retired successfully after owning a highly successful restaurant, in her 50s and 60s. So she was able to rebuild her life. I will say she never remarried. She never recovered from his death, but she was very successful. And then my sister, same story. I mean, she went bankrupt when she was 48. She rebuilt her financial life, selling and buying real estate, retired successfully. Then for Bruce, my 40s were very difficult for me. I was fired, I got divorced, my mother and brother died. By 38, I was broke. I was successful in rebuilding a second and third career. I remarried and retired financially successful. And what I found was that the next generation, my son and my sister's children, who are now in their mid-50s, all had similar experiences. So this is a very, very difficult time for people. Not everybody fits the pattern, but to give you a sense of the kind of challenges that many of us have gone through, I'm going to have my father tell you about his experience. This is from a letter that he wrote his mother about his situation.
With me, there's been despair, depression, anxiety, eternal hope, and fighting. I'm still building character, and by the way, I have learned some very valuable lessons such as patience, fortitude, human understanding, stamina, and the meaning of Christianity. Some things we must definitely learn about ourselves under stress, and there's no other way. The trick has been how to go through something like the last 2 years and still keep your mind and personality ready for the arduous task of continuously helping others solve their medical and personal problems. Maybe doing this has helped me keep my balance. It has certainly promoted self-discipline and no fooling. There were times when I was almost ready to throw in the sponge, but now I have never been more convinced that I am to be totally physically and spiritually well than at the present moment. With my own case, it can possibly be explained thus: when I was about 7 years old, my dad, in order to teach me to swim, threw me into the middle of a pool at Warm Springs where I could not touch bottom. I did not feel like laughing particularly at the time, and as I remember, no amount of excellent philosophy like be happy be glad would have been very helpful. As it turned out, he was right, because, since then I've had no fear of the water and at times have been considered a very good swimmer. My dad's insight into life was very good. I only bring this up as a matter of comparison. At times of trouble, it seems as if life again is teaching us a lesson the hard way, in which we either die, go down in disgrace, or come out stronger. Things usually turn out for the best, but for a time we are not too happy or communicative until we are able to make a so-called adjustment. The only difference this time is that I am 50, I have 4 other people to save and swim out with, while having a bum leg with degenerating bones and in much pain, to use in the swimming.
He basically, like all of these folks did, at one level or another, they rose to the occasion during that period of life. But at the time, it was very, very difficult. Certainly for me, when I look back at that time, I refer to myself as my wilderness years. And for me, it wasn't like 2 years, it was like 6 or 7 or 8. It was like from 44 to 50.
That
And it
was an
not
amazing letter, Bruce, by the way.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, quite touching, and I want to sort of share with you some of the ideas, not all of them. There's a lot of stuff. I'm going to share with you some of the ideas about levels of development, and I want you to think about where you might be now and where you might want to go and where you were in the past and so forth. This idea that, you know, you're at a certain level, you can't see the next level, you don't really understand the next level, in the same way that the 16-year-old can't understand the 25. But when you get to that next level, you can look back and see it. And so that's something to listen for as you're going through this. And let me just start by giving you the levels of development that the researchers have come up with as a model. And you notice that we have 5 of them here: impulsive, imperial, socialized, self-authoring, and self-transforming. I'm going to give you kind of a little understanding of each one, and then we're going to proceed with some other stuff. So the early impulsive is early childhood. So this is, you know, when we're growing up. We move into adolescence, but some people get stuck as an adolescent, and they can be 60 years old and still have the mentality of an adolescent. And that actually is 6% of the population. You know, some of them are probably incarcerated, but and I suspect that individuals who begin a drug career in their teens kind of get stuck in that level of development, you know, for many years thereafter, well into their adulthood. But you're focusing on your need, and you're following the rules, but you really don't have a value system. It's all avoiding the consequences as opposed to having a real solidified value system. Now, as 58% of the population have you know, they've adopted the ideas, norms, and the beliefs of their people and systems. And what I refer to that is cultural and parental programming. So we sort of are on a path that the culture provides for us, and it allows us to get a lot of approval for conforming to social norms we really don't have an independent sense of self. So our locus of control is really external rather than internal. And for me, I look at this period of time, you know, in the 50s, you go to high school, you go to college, you graduate from college, you go in the military, which is what I did, or not. You get married, and then you establish yourself as an adult with children and so forth. And it's just sort of like a path that's expected of you, and you just start going with the program. And I went with the program until I was, you know, in my 40s. But what happens is, for some, you know, notice that 58% of the population is still there. So somebody in 60s and 70s might still fall in this idea where they've really locked into the cultural norms, and they haven't been moved beyond that. It requires that that requires moving concepts from controlling us to we can control. In other words, what you're doing is you're starting to begin to individually decide what's important to you, rather than letting the society make that judgment for you. And typically, there's some things that happen that result in this transition to the next stage. And so 35% of the people are in self-authoring. So they developed an internal voice, they've reasserted their value system, and they're more at choice around what they're doing. They're clarifying their thoughts and beliefs and motivations, and they're curious about themselves, but they begin to set their own standard. A good example of that that's very dramatic is a woman who I've followed on TikTok who was a Mormon, and she had to break out of her family in a very, very dramatic way in order to become self-authoring. She had to give up her entire community. She had to give up her family who disowned her, and she just had to create a whole new life for herself in order to deconstruct from Mormonism. And she's now an aeronautical engineer and married, and seems to be very happy. But if she'd stayed in the Mormon culture where she was, you go to college, you get married. Girls did, and their role is to be a wife. So that's a fairly dramatic example of what happens when you move into this self-authoring mind. And then the fifth one, where we only have 1% of the population, is you have a sense of self that's not tied to particular identities and roles. And it occurred to me that I'm certainly not there. And by the way, most of us estimate our level of development higher than it actually is. So keep that in mind. And this is not one step, you move from one step to the other, and therefore, you moved very dramatically. It's a gradual process, and it transcends and includes the previous step. So you understand, how the world works from the lower level of development, but you're looking at it at a completely different perspective. So, you tolerate ambiguity and so forth. So as you look at this, let me go ahead and show you this. We have, each paradigm is almost like a new reality, and it transcends, includes the previous paradigm. So I follow the rules, I am my relationships. Here I have an identity and I make choices, and then I have many identities, embrace paradigm. And for me, to whatever degree I might be at stage 5, which I say I'm not really, it would seem to me that you only get to stage 5 when you retire, when you don't have all these demands where you have to have identities in your career and so forth. But you have to have that time to explore to really to make that shift. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So as you think about this, the idea is it's likely that you moved from, this idea where you were going with the program, where when you became and started thinking independently. So the question is, what does it take to change? And we're going to talk about those things, and I'm going to share another slide with you, which I think is very interesting. But first of all, I'm saying this may require this. It doesn't, demand that this be required. So you might not have a crisis, but still make the change. But sometimes these crises can be a disruptor, if you will, of the equilibrium, and kind of oblige you to really do some deep thinking. And for me, the time in my 40s, I did have time as a single person, unemployed a good deal, to do a lot of reflecting and cocooning, so to speak. So you're examining the old patterns and beliefs, and you're starting to develop new understandings. And, as my dad said, it takes a lot of courage to face your fears and to come out of that hero's journey in order to make those changes in your life and look at things from a different perspective. Now, here's the thing, while the journey is intensely personal, it's helpful to have support and guidance from others. But I'll tell you, for me, I didn't have that. I had this strong sense of wanting to be self-sufficient and to, kind of do it on my own. And that was an Achilles heel to some extent. I think, if I had had the support and sought out the support during that time, things would have looked very differently. So you really are, on a hero's journey. Go through a period of trial and struggle, and then you come out the other side to a world that's different. And then you kind of embrace that new identity. It might be a career change, it might be a change in your personal status, whether you've been married or not married. But it's a deep change. It's profoundly transformational, and it affects how we see ourselves in our relationships and how we see ourselves in the world. And of course, there are challenges, of course. Not everyone responds in the same way. I've had situations, you've probably met these folks. I remember one time on a Southwest flight, this old guy, he was about my age, but I looked at him as an old guy. And he moved his seat back, and I was in the last row, and it damn near broke my knee. And I said, could you move your seat back up a little bit? This is, it's very uncomfortable for me. And he damn near said he wanted to fight me, and was very angry about it. And there was no energy from me. It was from him. He was just, reacted and was very angry. And I really felt sorry for him. Well, he's just an angry old man, he had not done his work. And you've probably run into these people who they're just bitter, and it means they haven't done the work, and they really did not rise to the challenge and rethink things. They just wallow in bitterness for decades. It's kind of like the person who's divorced, and 10 years later, they still have energy and negativity and are really bitter about their ex-spouse. That kind of thing. So this is just another thing, and I'm not going to overload you with this stuff, but I find it's really interesting. And that is the shift from being ethnocentric or being egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric and eventually universe-centered. And think about this for a minute. If you look at it initially, we focus on our own needs, how we relate to ourselves, and we're self-interested. That's more like you would think you would be as a teenager. And and some people operate their whole lives based on their desires and their focus and their ambitions. Well, the idea is to move beyond that and start developing empathy and concern for others. And to do that, you move into this socially centered way. And this somewhat overlaps the socialized self, the 58% of the population. You recognize the rights and needs of others within one's own community and society. And this is really interesting because I see this so much in today's culture. There's just no empathy for people outside of the tribe. The liberals have no empathy for the plight of the people who are sort of in the Trump world, and the Trump world certainly does have no empathy for Democrats. I mean, many of them just want to kill them, which is just insane. And it requires moving beyond that, but we have a lot of people who are stuck in this particular level of development. And then the next one is worldview, or world-centered. And this is where you kind of become a global citizen and you sort of have a thought about things. Now, for instance, I saw pictures of the devastation in Lahaina, and I was really touched. I mean, it is awful. I mean, a video of going down the street and seeing all these burnout cars. And I've been to Lahaina before, and it's just beautiful. And to have that city just completely wiped off the map practically is heartbreaking. And, fine, they're part of the United States. I might have a little less empathy if that was in China, right? But you do have more of a sense of a global perspective. And let me tell you a couple of things about a personal story. I started learning about this and thinking about it. And one day I was driving my car, and I remember this very distinctly. I was on Briar Branch Drive, on Briar Forest, I think. Anyway, and I was on the phone. I was talking to someone in Indonesia on a help desk. And all of a sudden I realized, my God, I'm talking to someone on the other side of the planet on driving my car, down the street. It was just staggering to me. And since that time, when I talk with someone, I find out where they are. And I said, how are you doing today? I get more personal with them because they're part of who we are. And so you have a more sense of being human from a global standpoint. And the thing that is very, very disturbing to me is that if we do not have a worldview that is world-centered, we're not going to solve the problems that humanity is facing. We're not going to solve climate change. We're not going to solve autonomous weapons. We're not going to solve bioweapons. There has to be a global effort with cooperation from everybody to make this happen and make it real. And it doesn't seem to be the will there. And matter of fact, there's an element that says we don't want a world order, and they're highly resistant to that. Well, without a world order of some kind, you're not going to be able to solve these big problems that are threatening humanity. So the next one is universe-centered. And this probably is kind of the 1% where you're in kind of more of a spiritual place, maybe enlightened place. And, there's a profound sense of transcendence and perspective that continues to develop and evolve. So that's just another model that gives you kind of a sense of what we're talking about.